Would you like me to sit down?
Just
place over to you?
Just leave it there.
Okay.
I'm not mixed up. Yeah.
You see yourself right there in the lens. See, that's real technology. So say something nice.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to this fifth and last lecture in the Pavani lecture series for this year. I know that many of you have been coming to the lectures weekly and very faithfully and loyally, which has been truly gratifying. You are truly model citizens and intellectuals. It is your presence and also support which makes the Pavani lecture series successful and memorable as well, thus honoring Dr. Bohemia Pavani, for whom the lecture series is dedicated. As the speaker for the last lecture by Professor Rashid Khalidi emphasized, we have to understand the role beliefs play in international relations, because as he was conveying, directly and indirectly, it is one's belief which tends to determine one's ultimate choice in human interactions. But in cognitive psychology, it is well known that even if that is very true, we can change our beliefs, because we human beings are intelligent. We are capable of learning as well as unlearning. But what one's belief does to one's choice or action is very important. And it's important to remind ourselves of what role one's belief does play in determining or influencing one's behavior or choice, not only in regular interpersonal relations, in intergroup relations, and more broadly, international relations. We human beings, according to cognitive psychologists, feel more comfortable when realities we observe on the one hand, our beliefs on the other hand, are in accord. When they are in disaccord, we tend to feel disharmony or uncomfortable. So what do? We tend to try to make the realities conform to our beliefs. How do we do that? We can discredit the source of information about the realities. Simply say, well, you can't believe that, they are from Arabs or Israelis, so how can we believe it? That's one way. Another way of doing it is simply look for alternative, new source of information which is more in conformity with your own beliefs. Third way of doing it is simply to compartmentalize information you get about realities into pieces and then pick up those pieces fit into your own beliefs. And we tend to do that because, according to cognitive psychologists, we'll feel more comfortable that way. And if we persist in doing this, if we have prejudices, we'll tend to perpetuate those prejudices about the others being enemies or opponents or whatever they are. But I think, as I said earlier, we can learn and unlearn what we know. And to the extent that we are fully capable of doing that, I think there's a hope for the better world in the future. I think this is very important to remind ourselves of this necessity because we live in a unique era, namely the nuclear age, when the bell tolls for us all. And I think there is little to be gained for any one of us by insisting upon very rigidly one's own belief system. Always, in spite of the necessity to change it in the light of correct information that is made available to us. So there is some future for all of us. In any event, it is in this spirit that we have organized the Povanli lecture series under the umbrella topic of war and peace in the Middle East. For tonight, we have a special guest as speaker, Mark Bruzonsky. He's a special person in that he is a former government major. That's very important. Only smart people major in government. That's based upon my scientific observation for 43 years teaching. In any event, he graduated from Lawrence in 1969, and went to the New York University Law School, where he got the JD degree, and where he also was a so-called Ruth Tilden Scholar. Is that right? That's a very coveted position to hold. And then he went to Princeton University at Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, where he got an MPA. But much of his life up to this time has been devoted to journalism, mainly closely observing the Middle Eastern affairs, political, diplomatic, and others. In fact, he is known as one of the closest observers of the Middle Eastern scene. And he has been an honored guest of many countries, ranging from Egypt, Israel, to Pakistan, and to Libya, and the like. And then he also consulted the UN and other international organizations as well. At the same time, he has published extensively in books and journal articles, newspaper articles, and the like. Now, rather than for me to recite his accomplishment, I'll let him to talk to you, because he's much better in selling himself than myself. That's how he got majored in government, specializing in propaganda, which is a very important instrument of power politics. Well, in any event, rather than further giving all the details, I'll introduce to you tonight's speaker, who will talk on, for tonight for us, topic, from Camp David to 9/11. Did we bring it on ourselves? May I present to you Mark Bruzonsky.
Good evening. It's a bit difficult for me to believe that I left Lawrence over 30 years ago now. And this evening I'm privileged to speak to you for about 30 minutes and trying to sum up what I've learned in these 30 years. But first, before I start that clock, let me acknowledge that, and I truly mean this sincerely, had it not been for this first-class liberal arts education that I received here at this special university, for the self-confidence I was able to begin to develop when I was here, and for the guiding hands and minds of the excellent faculty here, many of whose faces I see, and it's remarkable to me they've changed quite very little. And to you, Chung-Do, a very special, sincere thank you. You were my mentor. You opened up for me subjects of inquiry, ways of thinking about and understanding our world, and you did it in a rich and very disciplined way. Plus, of course, I have you and Dr. Pavolny to thank for being here with you this evening. We're all at a major turning point in history. My goal this evening is more to discuss with you what is happening and why it's happening rather than just to lecture to you. Among the main things I've learned while traveling our world these past 30 years is the importance of honestly trying to discuss issues with others who see things very differently than we do. The importance of truly listening carefully to others, the importance of trying hard to understand others who have their own experiences, their own priorities, their own fears, and their own national as well as personal histories. And so I would like for a few moments to discuss with you now, in what has to be a brief summary, what I have learned about the history and sensibilities of today's Middle East, and why I think we have reached what is not just a clash of civilizations, but a clash within ourselves. And then let's spend the rest of our time together this evening discussing your concerns, all of our concerns. In a few moments, I will want to encourage your most probing and difficult questions, and I'll give you the most direct and insightful answers I can, well aware that some, maybe many of you, may not agree or like the conclusions that I have felt compelled to reach. As citizens of this modern-day empire at this profoundly crucial moment, we all are complicitous in what our country does. So let us use the next hour to be as serious and candid as we can and make this evening as worthwhile as we can. Now here's a very quick summary of what happened to me when I left Lawrence so you can put my own views into perspective, where I've been, who I've known, and what I've done. Yes, I got a Root Tilden scholarship and went to NYU Law School. What many of the professors may not know, and Chung-Do, you were on sabbatical at Stanford, so you probably don't know, my last year here, Curtis Tarr, the president of Lawrence, and a man about 7 feet tall, so you could see us marching around campus. He was also my mentor. I worked with him on state government things, went to Madison with him. He wrote my recommendations also to get into NYU. And then President Nixon made President Tarr the director of the Selective Service in Washington, the draft, the infamous draft. And that means that when I went to Washington, taking time off from law school, I would take my one suit and I would put it on, and the guards would all surround me at Selective Service headquarters thinking I'd come to protest, only to find out that sure enough I could go upstairs and meet with President Tarr, director of the Selective Service. And I went up in tears, explained to him that I'd be leaving for Canada soon. He told me to wait for the lottery. My number was high, so I graduated from law school and went on to Princeton. Meanwhile, and this also is thanks to a contact that started here at Lawrence, I became the chief representative of the United Nations for the International Student Movement for the UN. And this meant that in a rather crazy 3-year period, I visited some 35 countries. And of course, that changed my perspective and my relationships very much. After all that schooling, I was associate editor of Worldview magazine in New York, the interview editor for the Middle East magazine in London, the Washington representative of the World Jewish Congress, and then for a decade, I wrote a weekly column that appeared in many newspapers in the Middle East. All in all, I ended up making literally 200 international trips and personally meeting for private discussions or interviews with Anwar Sadat, Bruzonsky, Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, and many other of the senior personalities in the drama, which history now records as, mistakenly, in my view, the Middle East peace process. Let me now take you through the Middle East-related history of these years, going back to the original Camp David. I'm not referring to the recent Camp David. I'm referring to the 1978 Camp David and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. That's the period of time that I became personally involved. I go over these years, though, with you because, not because of my personal involvement, but because these years are crucial. They're the crucial backdrop if people want to understand how we came to 9/11 and how we've gotten to the moment that we're now all facing. Before Camp David in '78, of course, there were also historic moments, and time only permits me to very quickly go over those. Furthermore, it wasn't our country that was dominant at that time, it was the European colonial powers. But let's remember that during World War I, there was the Balfour Declaration, and then there was the secret, duplicitous Sykes-Picot Agreement, all designed to divide the Middle East rather than to allow a unified Arab state, as had been promised to the Arabs when they were attempting to get rid of the Ottoman Empire. Then there was the Paris Peace Conference, quote unquote, the Paris Peace Conference of 1918, since nicknamed, and rightly so, the peace to end all peace. Then the European powers of the day created the League of Nations and used it to legitimize their colonial rule of the region. And when the Arabs resisted, the French invaded Syria while the British took over Palestine, enthroning the Hashemites in Iraq, as well as in Transjordan, the Al-Sabas in Kuwait, the Al-Sauds in Arabia, and carving the region into the borders that we know it in today. At the end of World War II, largely because of American efforts, Palestine was partitioned against the will of the Arabs, leading to the War of 1948, a war which in fact has never ended, and from which much of the more recent Middle East history has flowed. In 1956, the British, French, and Israelis invaded Egypt, portraying Gamal Abdel Nasser in similar ways to the vilification these days of such personalities as Saddam Hussein and Yasser Arafat. In '67, there was the Six-Day War, one which the CIA secretly helped Israel win, very big and very fast. The American ship USS Liberty was attacked by the Israelis in a scandal never satisfactorily resolved. The Israeli settlements began at that time. Now 400,000 Israelis live in these settlements. $60 billion has been spent on them, and the idea of a peaceful coexistence between an Israeli state and a Palestinian state seems to be dissolving before our eyes. Then the 1973 war ended with the first regional nuclear alert, Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, and that diplomacy hasn't, in fact, ended. In one way or another, American shuttle diplomacy in tandem with Israeli guidance has continued ever since. All right, now to the period of history in which I have personally been involved and which, in my view, led to the events of 9/11 and what has happened the past few years. In 1977, in the days before Egyptian President Sadat decided he would be going to Israel personally, I met with him alone in Cairo and arranged the first public telegram ever sent from the Arab world to Israel. At the time, the very idea of being able to do anything in connection with Israel was totally unheard of. The next year at Camp David, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty was crafted, an agreement which actually inflamed the region and soon led to Sadat's assassination. Meanwhile, a multi-billion-dollar U.S. payoff was immediately provided to Egypt and has continued ever since. In the next few years, rather than a regional peace, the region exploded. The Israelis repeatedly invaded Lebanon, tremendously fanning the flames of the already hateful Lebanese civil war. The Iranian Revolution took place shortly after President Carter hosted the Shah at the White House, lavishly praising his despotic rule. And recently we've learned from declassified papers that the U.S. was working hard behind the scenes in those days to prod the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan, a Cold War proxy war from which that country has yet to recover. About the same time, the U.S., working closely with the Saudis and the Israelis, conspired to get then ally Iraq to invade Iran and attempt to reverse or at least greatly weaken the Iranian Revolution. The hostage scandal of those years probably led to the failure of the Carter presidency and its replacement with the Reagan era. Meanwhile, 1 million or more Iranians and Iraqis perished. Large numbers of others are living their lives as cripples. The two countries were exhausted at the time. While these other conflicts were taking place, in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon more massively than ever. This time, the U.S. and Israel secretly conspiring to try to overthrow the Syrian-connected Lebanese government and replace it with an Israeli-connected one. In the end, the plot failed, but only after tremendous death and destruction, the horrendous Palestinian refugee camp massacres, unprecedented U.S. shelling of Lebanon from naval ships, and then the suicide bombings of our embassy and the Marine Corps barracks, causing our troops to leave. Soon thereafter, the Americans announced yet another plan for peace in the Middle East, this one called the Reagan Plan. It was remarkably similar to the Sharon Plan of a few years before. The Arabs realized this immediately, realizing it was more deceit and more domination. It certainly wasn't justice for the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians had been repeatedly promised their own independent statehood now ever since the 40s. In the next few years, the Iranian-Contra scandal unfolded. Tensions throughout the region grew. The occupation of southern Lebanon encouraged the growth of what we today call Hezbollah. And by 1987, the Palestinian rebellion, the Intifada, erupted. Soon, Hamas was founded. Then, after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, ending in a stalemate, the U.S. manipulated Kuwait in ways that caused growing tensions with Iraq. And then, in August of 1990, with the U.S. misleading Iraq as to what U.S. reaction would be, Iraq invaded Kuwait. This, of course, led to the Gulf War and to the stationing of U.S. troops permanently in Saudi Arabia and throughout the region. After that war, there was another peace conference, this one called the Madrid Peace Conference, now recognized as but one more in a long series of Western-inspired conferences designed to buy more time, designed to manipulate the Arab parties, and always working closely in tandem with the Israelis. No matter how it was presented in public, that's how it was well understood throughout the Middle East. Madrid was followed by nearly 2 fruitless years of Washington talks. All the while, the Israelis continued building settlements, repressing the Palestinians more and more, violating UN resolutions when passed, and the U.S. was vetoing many resolutions, usually one vote against everybody else. Then in August of 1993, there was the Oslo Agreement, which the U.S. pushed hard on behalf of Israel to implement. This then led 2 years later to the Cairo Agreement, 2 years later to the Wye River Agreement, each one worse for the Palestinians than the one before, each one giving the Israelis more money, more guns, more political cover to pursue their own policies. 1993, let's remember, was also the year of the first bombing of the World Trade Tower. Meanwhile, with each passing year, Israeli repression of the Palestinians escalated. Settlements actually doubled in the decade of the 90s. And an apartheid-style reality began to take hold in the occupied territories, everything masked by the rhetoric of the American-sponsored peace process. In the last year of the Clinton administration, the U.S. and Israel essentially forced Yasser Arafat to Camp David, hoping to trap him in some kind of convoluted deal, as was done with Sadat 20 years earlier at the same location. That unprecedented political bungle, one in which the American president was himself considerably manipulated by the Israelis and their many supporters and agents in the United States, ended in disaster, though no one in the United States was willing to take responsibility, and certainly the American media didn't portray it that way. Indeed, Arafat had been extremely reluctant to even attend this Camp David II, only doing so after personal assurances from Clinton, personal assurances that now everyone has forgotten, that he, Arafat, would not be blamed for the failure that was foreseen. The next year, Intifada II erupted, far more poisonous, far more virulent, far more destructive than Intifada I a decade before. The next year, of course, was the year of 9/11. When 9/11 occurred, I got an urgent call from an editor friend at Playboy magazine. No, not the one in California. I told you I was doing a lot of traveling. Rather, one of the European franchises. My friend said they would hold the about-to-be-published October issue if I would immediately write an article trying to assess the meaning for the world of what had just happened. I spent the next 3 days furiously writing and rewriting, and this short article emerged. This is 3 days after 9/11, titled War of the Worlds, and at the last minute, President Bush gave me the quote to put at the top. Our president told us 5 days after 9/11, quote, "This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while. We will rid the world of the evildoers." And if I may, it's just a three-page article. The United States of America will surely prevail in the new war of our worlds in the short term. That is the case not because of any gods out there taking sides and not because of good or evil. These are metaphysical concepts, both of the mismatched combatants constantly insist on invoking, each within their own rich historical paradigms. The sheer military might and technological superiority of the Americans, now fully engaged in the wake of the surreal events of 11 September, is simply beyond the capabilities of anyone else on the planet to successfully resist in the short term. In the case of America's new war, the full might of the USA is being mobilized not against the armies of other nation states, but against the fanatical descendants of a puritanical militant Islam whose calling has become relentless opposition to American hegemony and passionate assertion of their own quaintly medieval religious constructs. This is hardly the next war that most anticipated since the great wars that decimated so much of Europe and Asia in the last century. But radical as it may sound to many of you, this is the war many in the American military-industrial establishment have been waiting to engage. And certainly this is not a war that actually began on 11 September 2001. Rather, it is a war that has been alternatively erupting and smoldering around the globe for some time now, with engagements already fought in many locales with a human toll already in the millions. From the genocide perpetrated on the people of Iraq, that's not my term, that's the term of both a former Attorney General of the United States and a resigned in moral disgust Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, to the teeming refugee camps of Lebanon and occupied Palestine, to the now rekindled war in Afghanistan, to the bloodbaths which have in recent years savaged places like Algeria, Kashmir, Chechnya, the former Yugoslavia. Not even consciously aware of where and how the early battles of this new war have already been fought, nor of the immense number of casualties others have already endured, the American people are now embarking on a crusade to cleanse the world of their enemies. All who oppose them are branded with the broad brush label terrorists, to be hunted down and destroyed. All who refuse to comply with the empire's commands, with the new world order of things, are to be considered complicitous and targeted. And yet there is an ominous nervousness, at least within American intellectual circles, as this massive reassertion of the New World Order begins to unfold. Whatever the upcoming fate of America's enemies, there will also be a huge cost the Americans will bear, at least in economic and psychological ways, if not in a basic undermining of the very pillars of their empire, both at home and abroad. Like the term Star Wars before it, the term New World Order was understood by the powers that be in Washington to represent too many negative associations to be carried over into the 21st century. But a fading terminology only masked the underlying depths of both the policy and the perspective behind the policy. It took President George W. only a few days to evoke the refrain, "This will not stand," just as his father had done a decade before. Never abandoned, the New World Order is now being resurrected in far more massive form, even though this time heavily masked under tons of rhetoric about the war against international terrorism. The fact that the American president has himself publicly used the very terminology of crusade shows just how insensitive the Americans still remain to Arab and Islamic history. Like most serious wars, underneath all the saber-rattling and patriotic slogans are imperial goals. The U.S. at this historical moment is the only superpower, but others, most especially the Chinese, are rising up determined to assert their own interests and visions of the future. As for the Arab and Muslim countries, they remain essentially carved up and de facto occupied, the lingering result of the end of World War I and that peace to end all peace in Paris back in 1918. Like the huge trade towers, which to everyone's amazement crashed down in just a few moments, the real questions about the future of our world when the winds of war subside this time will be which regimes will be left fully standing, which will be so weakened they will have to be dismantled and rebuilt, and what political, military, and economic structures will emerge anew to replace the dead, the dying, and the disfigured. The recent events already now behind us and sure to reverberate for foreseeable history on planet Earth are historical blowback for so much that has happened around the world in recent history. Future blowback, because of what is happening now, is inevitable, though very difficult to precisely predict. The new War of the Worlds is not likely to end soon or cleanly. Even should some new unstable point be reached by overwhelming force of arms, the whole host of terrible world tensions from before will remain, from the new space arms race to the potentially cataclysmic conflicts in Palestine and Kashmir, to the proliferation of deadly weapons of mass destruction, to the contradictions and inequities inherent in another of those American paradigms, globalization. And when it comes to this new War of the Worlds exploding in front of our eyes, it needs to be appreciated that a whole generation of destitute, desperate, and outraged Osamas have already been born. The New World Order was originally a construct attempting to explain and to organize the post-Cold War world according to multifaceted Western interests, overwhelming American power, and considerable American public innocence. Like Star Wars before it, the New World Order was abandoned rhetorically in order to further disguise its actuality. Now both are reborn with a second President Bush as commander-in-chief, leading America on a crusade it doesn't really understand, one that has very little to do with the previous world of Pearl Harbor, and one which surely will not end with a clean-cut surrender on a battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Now, by way of conclusion, I want to try to draw together even more clearly how these historical years, the past 2 or 3 decades, led to 9/11. Remember Camp David, 1978. President Sadat taken for a walk by President Carter, promising him that the Americans will actually pursue justice in the Middle East, promising him there would be a Palestinian state, promising him if only he, President Sadat, would do what the Americans want and do what the President of the United States was asking. Sadat had already called for his helicopter. The Egyptian delegation was already ready to leave. The conversation between presidents changed that, but didn't really change the outcome. 5 years later, I went to see Ibrahim Kamel, the foreign minister who had been at Camp David and who resigned as soon as Sadat explained to him what he was going to do. This wasn't a normal foreign minister. This was a friend of Anwar Sadat for 40 years. They were close intimates. As soon as Kamel was told by President Sadat what President Carter had urged him to do, he said, number one, I can't be part of it, and number two, it will inflame our region and prevent peace from ever coming to our region in our lifetime. And then Sadat was killed, of course, but why was he killed? Let me tell you a story you won't find in the history books, but which those of us who cover the Middle East know very well, and there's no confusion about it. At Camp David, Sadat was promised there would be an Israeli settlement freeze. There were only 40,000 Israeli settlers at the time. He was promised that by the President of the United States. That was probably one of the main reasons he decided to go against all of his advisors and go against everything that they had said before and agree to the peace treaty of 1979, actually. 1 week after the President of the United States went before the Congress and told the world what the agreement was all about, Moshe Dayan, the foreign minister of Israel, called the White House and said there'd been a slight misunderstanding, and he wondered what could be done about it. The slight misunderstanding was that instead of a settlement freeze, complete, total settlement freeze, Dayan said, we really meant for just 90 days. You can almost trace from that conversation not only the explosions in the Middle East, the creation of the intifadas, but also the assassination of Sadat. And his own friend Jimmy Carter didn't have the guts to stand up for him. Now, he did try. I'll tell you exactly what happened. At the time, I was more of an insider than I am now. I won't be able to tell you the inside stories of what's happening now. Carter was livid. He wanted to fight. He wanted to say Israel was going to have to live up to this agreement, which would have changed history, by the way, had the agreement been lived up to. He was going to go on national television and he was going to tell the American people what had happened, and he was going to say the Israelis had backed out of it for whatever reasons, and he was going to call for a total suspension of all American assistance to Israel. The vice president was Walter Mondale at the time. The two of them had a discussion that went pretty much like this. You can do that, Mr. President, but it's going to be a hell of a fight. Secondly, we're going to lose New York State in the upcoming election for sure if you engage in that fight. And thirdly, you're probably not going to be the President of the United States a year from now, which means you're not going to be able to fulfill your promises to Anwar Sadat, who was still alive at the time. So we're just going to have to eat this agreement. Well, at the time, of course, nobody quite knew the explosions it was going to lead to, the unraveling it was going to cause, how we'd get to this point in history that we're at now, but that's another major lesson one learns when one goes around the world and talks to people, especially those who have been involved. One thing does lead to another. And Camp David won, and what happened in those years led to someone else. His name is Ayman Zawahiri. He was a medical doctor, a young medical doctor in Cairo at the time. He thought his country had been sold out. He thought the Palestinians had been sold out. He thought his government had sold the Egyptian people out. He was right about all of those things. He became the assistant to Osama bin Laden and is the number 2 in Al-Qaeda. Apparently still alive, probably somewhere in the frontier areas of Pakistan. The Gulf War, 1991. Here's where Osama bin Laden came from. And let me tell you a personal story that I think explains fairly easily, actually, why Osama bin Laden became what he became. I was in Saudi Arabia in 1991. The troops were arriving. It was clear what was going to happen. I'd been at the Okaz newspaper, which is the biggest newspaper there, talking to the board of directors that evening, and then it's 12:30, and I had hoped they were going to take me back to my hotel, only to learn when I got out to the car that the publisher of the newspaper said, "Wouldn't you like to come with me for the evening?" I had no idea what he was talking about, but he said this was their weekly gathering. When I got to the gathering, it was a room about this size with maybe 15 people sitting around in big chairs. The wealthy elite, the intellectual elite of Saudi Arabia. This is 1991. And they conducted their business. It's now about 1:30 in the morning. They then switched to English, welcomed me to their midst, said they had a lot of questions, and we began. And after about 45 minutes, a man across the room who hadn't said a word. He just sat there all night. He just looked up, he looked at me, and the moment he opened his mouth, I knew this wasn't a normal guy. His English was absolutely perfect. He not only was educated here, he'd gone to Berkeley, and I was told he was, a pretty substantial member of Saudi society. And he began by complimenting me and began I thought he was sort of setting me up. He was going to really lay into me for, I'd expressed some rather harsh views about this war and what the Saudis were doing. And I'd also said they thought at the time their king was telling them the American troops were coming, the war was going to be fought, then the American troops were leaving, and life goes back to normal. I told him we weren't leaving. He looked at me and he said, it was very simple, he said, "This evening you've used the word dignity a number of times since you began answering our questions, and I understand you'll be leaving our kingdom in 3 days. So please let me tell you the following, which you should remember from now on. You should remember that this word dignity, of which you have spoken, no longer exists in the dictionary of the Arabs." And I sat there, realizing I was with the Saudi elite, and he didn't say a word about the war, about the king, about any of the specific issues that I had been discussing with them, but he told me everything I needed to know, that they well understood what this meant. They well understood their dignity had been taken. They well understood their history was being trampled. Somewhere in that country, in that same year, was Osama bin Laden, probably having similar discussions with a group that I don't have much in common with and was never invited to meet with. But he, too, realized that the dignity of his history, the dignity of his country, was being taken from them. He obviously made the decisions he made, and one part of history leads to another. And then Camp David recently, the one that the students at this university probably think is the Camp David Conference rather than the one back in 1978. It was a conspiracy. It was a joint Israeli-American attempt to force Yasser Arafat into a deal, to put him in a similar position to the position that Anwar Sadat had been in. They tried, they twisted, they cajoled, they did everything you can imagine. Billions of dollars were on the table for Arafat's cronies and his corrupt minions. But in the end, Arafat didn't accept, not because he didn't want the money, and frankly not because he himself isn't corrupted. He didn't accept for two reasons. One, because he knew he couldn't sell it back home. He knew his own people just wouldn't stomach it. Hanan Ashrawi, the spokesman for the delegation, had already picked up from Camp David and said she wouldn't even talk about this anymore. She'd already gone home. And that led to Intifada 2. And then, of course, 9/11. Now, I'm not saying there's a direct link, and you can say that if this didn't happen one year, this wouldn't have happened the next year. I've simply tried to give you an overall perspective of how things look to the people in the Middle East, and frankly, how they look to me after spending so much time there and after having been, at least for a good part of this period, on the inside, seeing what was really happening. Now, here we are, 2003, and history's unfolding in front of our nose, and in the future, there will be other lectures, 10 or 20 or 30 years, maybe by some of the students who are here in the room this evening. Let me share with you what a few people have said in recent days and then turn to your own questions. I don't know if you've heard these things here in Appleton. I know they're pretty much buried by the American press, but they resound greatly around the world. The Pope himself has made a number of very strong statements in opposition to this war. Of course, he couches things in Vatican diplomatese. Nelson Mandela has lashed out in the last few weeks in ways that nobody can remember him ever speaking up this harshly. He said in public, the Americans have a president who can't think, and they're leading the world to a Holocaust. His term, his term. Walter Cronkite. There's enough older people in the audience to know who Walter Cronkite is. I'm amazed. I was at the University of Chicago this weekend, and there were 3,000 of the best and the brightest high school students. Some are going to be coming here. They didn't know who Walter Cronkite was. I told them he was much more than the Dan Rather of his era. All right, but those of us who are old enough to know, here's probably the most distinguished and most credible man in the news business. He has actually gotten up and said that he fears his government is now pushing the world toward World War III. His term, not mine, his term. Didn't get reported in your newspapers. You won't see it on 60 Minutes. He gave the speech at Texas A&M. The only place you can actually read about it is the Texas A&M newspaper, and I personally called down to make sure it was really true. He also made some allusions to what's happening in our country that has happened to other countries in history. John le Carré, we all read his novels. He's actually published in Britain essays saying the U.S. has gone crazy. The U.S. is insane. His terms, not my terms, his terms, front page, Daily Mirror. Ramsey Clark is easily dismissed in this country because he's been doing this for 40 years now, but he's a very thoughtful man, not really an expert on world affairs, but a real expert on human rights and a real expert on justice. He was the Attorney General, as many of you will remember. He is leading a campaign not only for the president's impeachment, but for trying top American officials as war criminals. And the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Dennis Halliday, an Irishman, probably someone whose name many of you don't know. This is a man who spent 30-some years in the UN bureaucracy, his entire career. He rose to the rank of Assistant Secretary General. Then they sent him to Iraq a few years ago to administer the UN programs there, especially the Food for Peace program. He spent about a year and a half, and then he couldn't do it anymore. And he simply got up and he said, I've been asked to be complicitous in genocide. My organization, the United Nations, has become complicitous in genocide. The Security Council has been hijacked. Now, this is from the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations who spent 30-some years in his career doing this work. And anybody who knows anything about the UN knows that to survive for 30-some years in that bureaucracy, you've got to be a very patient and very diplomatic fellow. But he couldn't do it anymore. His conscience just got the better of him. He was in the field. He wasn't at UN headquarters. He was in the field seeing what was happening to millions of people and hearing the stories from Arabs and from Iraqis about the history of the region, no doubt hearing about the history of many of the things that I've discussed with you this evening. Well, you've been very gracious, and I thank you that not only that you have had me here this evening, but that you've listened to me thoughtfully and politely. These are not just intellectual issues for people like myself, whose friends are in the Middle East and whose relationships are in the Middle East.